prescience is a curse, a chalice of poison disguised as a gift from the gods. We believe the master of mankind sits immobile upon the golden throne, his mind the only lighthouse in a galaxy of infinite darkness. We believe he alone sees the path, but the immaterium is vast, and the tides of fate are treacherous. What happens when another vision challenges the Emperor's design? What happens when a jagged thread from a forgotten tapestry, a universe of spice and sandworms, weaves itself into the rot of the 41st millennium? An anomaly has been detected in the Segmentum Pacificus, a man who speaks with the weight of a gravity well, a man who commands the fanaticism of a Primarch, yet bears no gene seed. He is not a Psyker as we know them, yet he bends the minds of the weak with a whisper. He calls himself Muad'Dib, and he has not come to serve the throne. He has come to supplant it.
Consciousness returned to Paul Atreides, not with the dry, clean purity of the desert, but with the choking taste of sulfur and the metallic tang of recycled air. He lay prone on a surface of cold, pitted ferrocrete, his body racked by a gravity that felt subtly wrong, heavier, more oppressive than Caladan, yet lacking the precise parched bite of Arrakis. Slowly, he rose, his Bene Gesserit training instantly cataloging the sensory data. The air was thick with particulate matter, a oily smog that clung to the back of the throat, tasting of promethium and decay. Above him, the sky was a bruised purple, dominated by a sun that burned with a sickly, dying red light, filtered through layers of atmospheric pollution so dense it felt like a physical weight. He closed his eyes, reaching out with the inner eye, the prescient sense that had crowned him emperor of the known universe. He sought the familiar threads of the future, the golden path he had so agonizingly forged. They were gone. In their place was a roaring, chaotic ocean of screaming souls, a psychic cacophony so loud, so malevolent that he physically recoiled, gasping for breath. The stars here were wrong. The constellations were twisted, unrecognizable, as if the galaxy itself had been broken on a rack. He was no longer in the universe he had conquered. He was adrift in a hell where the spice did not flow, but where blood and oil greased the gears of existence. Paul moved through the shadows of the immense structure he had awakened within, a hive of industry that dwarfed the sieges of the Fremen. The architecture was oppressive, monolithic blocks of gray stone and iron, adorned with skulls and weeping gargoyles, built not for habitation but for intimidation. He observed the populace, wretched, hunched figures shuffling in lines, their faces obscured by crude, rattling rebreathers. They wore rags the color of ash, their skin pale and covered in sores. But it was the servitors that truly horrified the Atreides sensibilities. Men and women lobotomized, their limbs replaced with hydraulic claws and rock drills, their eyes replaced with glowing red lenses. Thinking machines, the Orange Catholic Bible had forbidden, but this was a desecration of the biological sanctity of man that even the Tleilaxu would find crude. These people were not citizens, they were fuel. Paul blended into the crowd, his prana bindu control allowing him to slow his heartbeat, to minimize his presence until he was nothing more than another ghost in the smog. He listened to their whispers, hearing a dialect of Low Gothic that sounded like a bastardized cousin of Galak. They spoke of quotas, of the tithe, and of the God Emperor. The title struck Paul like a physical blow. A God Emperor? Here? Was this a reflection? A mockery, or a future he had failed to prevent? The rhythm of the work gangs was broken by the harsh bark of amplified vocals. Paul watched from the periphery as a squad of enforcers marched into the plaza. They were clad in carapace armor painted a drab olive, wielding rifles that hummed with a contained energy, las guns, crude but effective. This was the Planetary Defense Force, the brutal overseers of Golgotha Secundus. The squad leader, a brute of a man with a cybernetic jaw, grabbed an elderly miner who had collapsed under the weight of an ore crate. There was no mercy in the act, no water discipline or communal preservation. The officer raised a shock maul, the energy field crackling with blue arcs, and brought it down across the old man's back. The sound of breaking bone was sickeningly audible over the drone of the atmospheric scrubbers. The crowd flinched but did not intervene. Their spirits had been broken by generations of servitude. The officer raised the maul again, intending a killing blow. Paul's mentat computation was instantaneous. Intervention was illogical. It would reveal him. It would accelerate the timeline of conflict. But the Atreides blood, the code of the Duke, did not bow to logic when cruelty was displayed so nakedly. Stop. The word did not come out as a shout, but as a physical force. Paul projected the voice with a precision that cut through the ambient industrial noise like a laser through silk. He pitched his vocal cords to resonate with the specific bone density and nervous system of the officer. The effect was catastrophic. The officer didn't just freeze, his body went rigid as every muscle seized simultaneously. The shock maul fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the rockcrete. The officer grabbed his helmet, screaming as the harmonics of Paul's voice bounced inside his skull, rupturing the delicate capillaries in his inner ear. Blood poured from the man's nose and tear ducts. The other troopers spun around, weapons raised, but they were trembling, their discipline shattered by the sheer impossibility of the sound. They looked for a weapon, a psyker's staff, a grenade, anything to explain the assault. They found only a slender man in a torn flight suit, standing with the regal bearing of a king, his eyes burning with an intense, blue within blue luminosity that pierced the gloom. Paul did not raise his hands. He merely looked at them, and in that gaze they saw a predator far more dangerous than the feral beasts of the underheave. Silence descended upon the plaza, heavy and terrified. The miners stared at Paul, their eyes wide behind their dirty goggles. They did not see a man, they saw a miracle. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, power such as this was usually the mark of a witch, a thing to be burned. But Paul stood with such unshakable authority, such noble defiance against their oppressors, that the superstition of the masses pivoted. A whisper started at the back of the crowd, growing like a sandstorm. "Saint," one murmured. "A living saint," another replied. Paul felt the shift in the air, a familiar and terrifying weight settling upon his shoulders, the mantle of the Messiah. He had tried to escape this destiny in his own universe, only to find it waiting for him here, hungry and gaping. He looked at his hands, feeling the weirding hum in his veins. The warp, that great chaotic ocean he had sensed earlier, seemed to lean in, interested in this new variable. He was Paul Muad'Dib Atreides, Duke of Arrakis, and if this universe wanted a god, he would show them what a god truly looked like. He stepped over the convulsing body of the officer and looked at the crowd. "The spice does not flow here," he said, his voice carrying to the back of the hall without aid. "But the chains break just the same."
Confessor Varys sat ensconced within the scriptorium of the Cathedral of St. Drusus, the air thick with the cloying, sweet-wrought scent of heavy incense and old parchment. The only sounds in the vast candlelit chamber were the scratching of his autoquill, a servo skull hovering at his shoulder, etching his dictates onto vellum made from human skin, and the distant, rhythmic thumping of the hive's ventilation fans. Varys was a man carved from granite and faith, his robes of crimson velvet weighed down by purity seals and the golden icon of the Aquila. He reread the report from the lower levels for the third time, his lip curling in a sneer of pious disgust. A miracle worker in the mines? A man who could rupture a skull with a whisper? The ecclesiarchy knew of such things. They were usually untrained psykers, dangerous conduits to the warp that required immediate sanctioning or liquidation. Yet the report spoke of something else, a charisma that had quelled a riot not with fear, but with awe. The miners were calling him the voice from the outer dark. Varys signaled the temple guard with a wave of his gloved hand. "Bring the off-worldler to me," he commanded, his voice gravelly with authority. "Let us see if he bleeds like a saint or burns like a witch."
When the heavy adamantium doors of the scriptorium groaned open, Varys expected a raving madman or a trembling wretch. Instead, the figure that was marched in between 4 carapace-armored temple guards moved with the fluidity of water and the predatory grace of a feline. Paul Atreides wore the rough-spun rags of a penal laborer, yet he wore them like the royal raiment of a high lord of Terra. His hands were bound in plasteel manacles, but his posture suggested he was merely tolerating the restraints out of curiosity rather than compulsion. Varys rose from his dais, intending to tower over the prisoner, but found himself arrested by the stranger's eyes. They were not merely blue, they were a total saturation of indigo, devoid of white, glowing with an inner luminescence that unnerved the confessor. "Kneel," Varys intoned, his voice amplified by the vox grill at his collar. "Kneel before the servant of the God Emperor and confess thy sins." Paul did not move. He tilted his head, studying the opulent cathedral, the statues of martyrs, and the golden eagle, as if analyzing the anthropology of dead culture. "I see you worship the golden path here," Paul said softly, his voice devoid of fear. "But you have forgotten the steps." "Blasphemy," Varys hissed, descending the steps of the dais, his power maul deactivated but heavy in his grip. "There is only the Emperor, he who sits on the golden throne, the master of mankind. To suggest a path other than his will is heresy." Paul met his gaze, and for a moment Varys felt a terrifying sensation, as if his mind were a book being sped-read by a computer. "Your Emperor sits," Paul replied, his tone clinical, cutting deep into Varys's dogma. "I offer movement. I offer evolution. I am the Kwisatz Haderach, the shortening of the way. Your God is a prisoner of his own foresight. I am its master." The silence that followed was absolute. Varys's face turned a shade of apoplectic purple. This was not simple heresy. This was a theological deconstruction so precise it threatened the very foundation of his faith. The confessor raised his maul, thumbing the activation rune. "You are no saint. You are a demon in human skin. Guards, strike him down. Purge this filth." The 4 temple guards lunged, their shock staffs crackling with lethal voltage. In the clumsy eyes of the Imperium, the outcome was inevitable, an unarmed man in chains against 4 trained killers. But to Paul, trained in the weirding way and fueled by the data stream of prescience, they moved through molasses. He did not use the voice this time. He used the mechanics of the body. He pivoted on his heel, the movement so fast it blurred the air. As the first guard struck, Paul sidestepped by a millimeter, allowing the staff to pass harmlessly, then snapped his manacled wrists up. The plasteel chain caught the guard's throat, and with a precise twist of his hips, he used his own momentum to flip him, shattering his cervical vertebrae against the stone floor. The second and third guards attacked in tandem. Paul dropped to a crouch, sweeping the leg of one while driving his shoulder into the solar plexus of the other. It was a display of prana bindu muscle control, absolute mastery over every nerve and fiber. Within 3 seconds, the 4 guards lay groaning or unconscious, their armor dented, their weapons scattered. Paul stood amidst the carnage, breathing rhythmically, his pulse unchanged. He looked at the manacles, applied a specific torque to the locking mechanism with his fingers, and snapped them open as if they were made of paper. Varys backed away, his back hitting the cold stone of the altar. He was trembling, his shock maul raised defensively, but the terror in his eyes betrayed him. He had seen Astartes fight, he had seen death cult assassins, but he had never seen a baseline human move with such mathematical lethality. This was not warpcraft. There was no smell of ozone, no frost. This was biological perfection. Paul stepped closer, kicking a shock staff aside. "I do not require your worship, priest," Paul said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that vibrated in Varys's chest. "But do not stand in my way. The jihad is coming, whether your throne wishes it or not." Paul turned and walked out of the great doors, leaving the confessor alive to deliver the message. As soon as the shadow of the Atreides vanished, Varys scrambled to the Vox array station behind the altar. His hands shook as he punched in the encryption keys, bypassing the local planetary governor and sending a signal straight to the sub-sector monitoring station. He keyed the highest priority code available to his station. Transmission, Vermilion level, he gasped into the receiver. Subject is designated Heretics Extremis, requesting immediate intervention of the Holy Ordos. God Emperor save us. The anathema is here. The sky above Hive Primus did not merely darken, it was bruised by the arrival of the Hammer of Witches. The inquisitorial black ship, a Gothic cathedral engine of void-hardened steel, descended through the cloud layer like a jagged splinter of hate. Inside the command rhino of the landing party, Inquisitor Kalen of the Ordo Hereticus checked his bolt pistol's spirit rune for the third time. Kalen was a man of absolute definitions. There was the Emperor's light, and there was the darkness. He had purged systems for less than what the initial reports claimed of this Lisan al-Gaib. The air in the transport smelled of sacred oils and ozone as the ramp slammed down into the mud of the lower hab blocks. "Spread out," Kalen commanded, his voice distorted by a rebreather grill. "Sanction extremist protocols are in effect. If it breathes and does not bear the Aquila, it dies." A platoon of inquisitorial stormtroopers, the Tempestus Scions, poured out, their hellguns humming with lethal charge. They moved with mechanical precision, red tactical lumens cutting through the industrial smog, hunting for the heretic who dared command the voice of a god. The lower levels of the hive were a labyrinth of rusted pipes and dripping promethium, usually teeming with the vermin of the underclass. Today, it was silent. Kalen's tactical sense twitched. This was not the silence of fear, but the silence of a predator holding its breath. The stormtroopers advanced into a wide manufacturing plaza, their boots clanking on the metal grating. Suddenly the shadows detached themselves from the walls. The miners, Paul's new Fedakeen, did not scream war cries to the blood god or praise the ruinous powers. They struck with the terrifying, disciplined silence of the desert. Improvised flash grenades blinded the Scion's autosenses, followed instantly by the wet tearing of plasteel knives finding the unarmored joints of carapace suits. These were not rabble. They moved in perfect synchronization, utilizing cover and verticality with a proficiency that defied their station. Kalen fired his bolter, exploding a miner's torso, but he saw the look in the man's eyes before he died. There was no madness there. Only the fanatical, diamond-hard certainty of a believer who knows paradise awaits. "Auspex sweep," Kalen roared, backhanding a miner who lunged at him with a sharpened pry bar. "Pinpoint the Alpha." He pulled a relic-grade Psi-tracker from his belt, a device blessed on Holy Terra designed to detect the witch taint of the warp. He aimed it at the center of the engagement, where the fighting was thickest. The machine spirit within the device wailed in confusion. The needles spun wildly, not registering the familiar purple miasma of the immaterium, but rather a cold, hard void, a singularity of pure calculation. There was no warp signature. The subject was not drawing power from the sea of souls. He was bending reality through some other, older law of physics. "Impossible," Kalen muttered, tapping the glass dial. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. Paul Atreides walked through the firefight, unhurried, wearing a stillsuit fashioned from recycled flak armor. He held no weapon, yet the stormtroopers around him seemed to stumble, their aim pulled astray by the sheer weight of his presence. Kalen signaled his personal executioner, a Vindaiker sniper perched on a gantry 300 meters above. The shot was calculated to the microsecond, an adamantium-tipped penetrator round aimed directly between the heretic's eyes. Kalen watched, expecting the pink mist of a kill, but Paul paused. He did not duck. He did not flinch. He simply shifted. It was a movement of minimal effort, a slight tilt of the head to the left, executed a fraction of a second before the sniper pulled the trigger. The bullet hissed through the space where Paul's skull had been a heartbeat prior, sparking harmlessly against a bulkhead. Paul looked up, his indigo eyes locking directly onto Kalen across the chaotic battlefield. The Inquisitor felt a chill that his power armor could not insulate against. This was not reflex. This was not luck. The heretic had lived this moment 1,000 times in his mind before it happened. He was navigating time as easily as a man navigates a room. "Abort!" Kalen shouted into the Vox, realizing the tactical situation had collapsed into a slaughter. Retreat to extraction. Prepare for exterminatus. If he could not kill the man, he would kill the city. He would burn the entire hive to ash to contain this infection. The stormtroopers fell back, firing suppression volleys, dragging their wounded. Kalen reached the extraction Valkyrie, punching in the authorization codes to the orbiting hammer of witches to fire the cyclonic torpedoes. In the name of the Emperor, I consign this world to... Static screamed in his ear. The sky above, previously choked with smog, began to churn violently. This was not a natural weather system, a massive localized storm, reminiscent of the Coriolis storms of Ericus, but magnified by the psychic resonance of the 41st millennium, erupted instantly. Winds of impossible velocity slammed into the black ship in orbit, blinding its targeting arrays and tossing the massive vessel like a toy in a bathtub. Paul stood below, arms spread, seeming to conduct the hurricane. Kalen watched in horror as the Valkyrie pilot struggled to keep them airborne. The exterminatus was denied. The planet itself was fighting for the Lisan al-Gaib.
Primaris Psyker Malakian stepped from the shadows of the loading bay, the copper conducting rods embedded in his skull humming with a nauseating vibration. He was a creature of sanctioned agony, his soul bound to the golden throne, his mind a fortress constantly under siege by the horrors of the immaterium. He looked upon the intruder, the Lisan al-Gaib, and saw not a man, but a void in the ether. Where every living soul shone like a candle in the warp, Paul Atreides was a black hole, a singularity of such intense self-control that he seemed to exist outside the Emperor's light. Malakian gripped his force staff, the adamantium tip frosting over as the ambient temperature in the plaza plummeted 20 degrees in a heartbeat. Frost crawled rapidly across the rusted deck plates, and the air filled with the smell of ozone and wet dog, the scent of the witch mark. "You traffic with powers you do not comprehend," Malakian rasped, his voice layered with the whispers of the voices in his head. "I am the instrument of his will. I am the gatekeeper. Burn." Malakian thrust his staff forward, and the reality of the material universe shrieked. A torrent of biolightning, not clean elemental electricity, but the purple and sickly green fire of the Empyrean erupted from his eyes and fingertips. It was an assault that boiled blood and flayed souls. It struck Paul square in the chest. But Paul did not burn. He did not scream. He stood rooted in the prana bindu stance of the first level, his mind reciting the litany against fear, turning his consciousness into a prism that refracted the pain rather than absorbing it. The warp fire washed over him, hungering for a purchase on his soul, but finding no fear to latch onto. Paul's metabolic control was absolute. He shunted the thermal energy through his nervous system, dissipating it into the ground beneath his feet, turning the rockcrete to slag around his boots. To the observers, it looked as though the lightning was terrified of him, bending away from his skin at the last microsecond. Paul opened his eyes, the blue within blue blazing with a ferocity that eclipsed the Psyker's witchfire. He did not look at Malakian's body, he looked into his mind. In the Dune universe, Paul had feared the abomination, the loss of self to the ancestors. Here he saw the true face of abomination. Hovering behind the Sanctioned Psyker, just beyond the veil of reality, were things of teeth and shadow, waiting for the man's concentration to slip. Paul saw the great enemy. He saw the chaos gods leering through the cracks in Malakian's sanity, and they saw him. For a brief, terrifying moment, the predators of the warp recoiled. They did not recognize this flavor of power. It was not sorcery. It was not faith. It was cold, mathematical evolution. Paul pitied the man. "You are a window that cannot be closed," Paul spoke, his voice cutting through the crackling energy. "I shall close it for you."
Paul took a single step forward, inhaling a breath measured in cubic millimeters. He focused his entire being, the Bene Gesserit training, the Mentat computation, the Kwisatz Haderach's foresight, into a single vocalization. He did not shout. He uttered a pitch that resonated with the specific frequency of the bio-implants and ganglia controlling Malachian's connection to the warp. Sleep. The word hit the Psyker like a physical hammer. It bypassed the eardrums and vibrated the medulla oblongata. The Psyker's force field shattered like glass. The Psyker gasped, his connection to the immaterium severed violently, not by psychic dampening, but by his own body betraying him. His synapses misfired. The lightning died instantly, leaving only the smell of charred meat. Malachian fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the voice commanded his autonomic nervous system to shut down the higher brain functions that channeled the warp. Malachian lay on the cold ground, his body seizing as his organs failed one by one, commanded to cease by a superior will. The shadows around him receded, the frost melted. In his final moments of consciousness, stripped of the warp's screaming noise, Malachian looked up at Paul with a clarity he had not known since childhood. His milky, cataract-filled eyes widened. He didn't see a heretic anymore. He saw the true face of abomination. The vision that Paul carried, the terrible, golden, singular path that stretched across the stars, a road paved with necessary atrocities to ensure the survival of the species. It was not the Emperor's light, but it was a light. The path, Malachian wheezed, blood bubbling past his lips. It cuts the ocean. The Primaris Psyker slumped forward, dead. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. Paul stood over the corpse, the static of the encounter fading from his clothes. He looked up at the sky, where the storm he had summoned still raged. He had defeated the warp today, but he knew the truth. The great eye was now watching him.
The sky tore open, bleeding fire. There was no warning siren, only the sonic boom of atmospheric re-entry that shattered the stained glass windows of the hab blocks. The drop pods of the Black Templars descended like meteorites of judgment, their hulls scorched by the heat of their righteous fury. Inside the lead pod, his will, Castellan Draco recited the catechism of hate, his voice a growl that reverberated through the vox links of his sword brethren. The impact shook the foundations of the hive city. Retro thrusters fired in a deafening burst of promethium, and the explosive bolts blew the assault ramps down onto the rockcrete. Draco surged forth, a giant clad in midnight black ceramite, the cross of Maltese blazing on his pauldrons. His bolter, Absolution, roared its opening stanza. The mass reactive shells found the bodies of the rebel miners, Paul's brave Fedaykin, and reduced them to red mist and wet shrapnel. To the Astartes, these were not freedom fighters, they were weeds in the Emperor's garden, and Draco was the scythe. The slaughter was industrial in its efficiency. The Fedaykin fought with the desperation of the doomed, hurling themselves at the Space Marines with pry bars and stolen lasguns. It was like waves crashing against a cliff of iron. Lasbolts merely scorched the paint of the Astartes' power armor, while every return shot from a Godwin-patterned bolter resulted in a catastrophic loss of life. Draco waded through the melee, holstering his bolter and drawing his chainsword Soul Leader. The weapon revved with the scream of 1,000 angry hornets, its monomolecular teeth hungry for flesh. He backhanded a charging rebel, the servo-enhanced strength of his arm shattering the man's ribcage and sending him flying 10 meters into a support pillar. No pity, no remorse, no fear, the Templars chanted in unison, a wall of black and white advancing through the smoke. They were the angels of death, and they had come to harvest. Hold! The command cut through the din of battle, not loud, but carrying an imperative weight that made even the psycho-conditioned minds of the Astartes pause for a microsecond. The rebels parted, revealing the slight, unarmored figure of Paul Atreides. To Castellan Draco, the sight was insulting. This was the threat, this baseline human, frail and unaugmented, standing amidst the carnage of his followers? Draco stomped forward, the servos in his legs hissing, the ground trembling under his half-ton weight. He towered over Paul, a demigod of war facing a gnat. "You are the false idol," Draco boomed, his helmet's grill amplifying his voice to a terrifying volume. "You have led these ignorant souls to damnation. I shall offer you the Emperor's mercy." Paul did not flinch. His eyes, blue voids of calculation, scanned the Castellan. He saw the thick ceramite plates, the exposed cabling at the joints, the grill of the Voxcaster. He did not see a monster, he saw a machine, a slow, heavy, predictable machine. Draco lunged, a strike that would have bisected a light tank. The chainsword swept down in a diagonal arc, faster than the human eye could track, but Paul was not relying on his eyes. He had seen the blow 3 seconds ago in the corridors of time. He moved not to block, that would be suicide against transhuman strength, but to exist where the blade was not. He flowed like water around a stone, the roaring teeth of the chainsword missing his chest by a fraction of an inch, the wind of its passage tearing his rags. Paul spun inside the Astartes guard, a move of suicidal bravery. He carried no crysknife, but he held a shard of adamantine drill bit scavenged from the mines. He struck the soft seal of the armpit joint, the weak point in the armor his prescience had highlighted. The shard skittered off the hardened undersuit, but the impact was precise enough to sever a hydraulic line. Oil sprayed like black blood. Draco roared in fury, backhanding the space where Paul had been, but striking only air. The Castellan stepped back, the fluid leak causing his right arm to lag by a millisecond, a fatal flaw in a duel of this caliber. For the first time in centuries of war, Draco felt a flicker of confusion. This heretic moved with the preternatural grace of the Eldar, yet fought with the calculated brutality of a machine. Paul stood 10 paces away, holding the bloody shard, his breathing controlled, his pulse steady. He had tested the angel's defenses and found them formidable, but finite. "Your armor is a crutch. You rely on the strength of your forge masters, not the strength of your mind." Draco revved his chainsword, the engine snarling a challenge. The initial skirmish was over. The execution had failed. The duel had begun.
To the unaugmented human eye, the combat speed of an Adeptus Astartes is a blur of violence, a phenomenon known as transhuman dread. It is the biological horror of seeing something so massive move faster than a striking cobra. But Paul Atreides did not see with human eyes. He saw with the curse of the Kwisatz Haderach. As Castellan Draco initiated a killing sequence, a feint with the combat blade followed by a decapitating swing of the chainsword, Paul was already living in the moments after the blow had missed. The world slowed to a crawl. He watched the servo bundles in Draco's gauntlet contract, the slight shift in weight on the balls of the Astartes' feet, the gyroscopic stabilization of the power pack. It was not a fight, it was a geometry equation, and Paul had already solved for X. He stepped inside the arc of the roaring weapon, the monomolecular teeth screaming past his ear, close enough to feel the heat of the friction. Paul's movements were jerky, unnatural to the observer, the weirding way of the Bene Gesserit, manipulating kinetic energy and perception. He appeared to teleport short distances, his image blurring as he exploited the microlags in the Space Marine's visual processing cogitators. Draco spun, his tactical logic baffled. His target was a ghost. He engaged his helmet's autosenses to track the heat signature, but Paul was already moving again. This time, Paul went on the offensive. He knew he could not penetrate the thick ceramite chestplate with a scavenged shank. He needed to dismantle the machine from the outside. As Draco raised his bolter for a point-blank execution, Paul unleashed the voice. This was not the command of domination used on the weak-minded. This was a sonic weapon. He projected a sound, a sharp clicking syllable that hit the resonance frequency of the Astartes' external audio pickups. Inside Draco's helmet, the sound was amplified 1,000-fold. The feedback loop shrieked like a dying banshee, momentarily overwhelming the Castellan's liman's ear, the inner ear organ designed to prevent dizziness. For a split second, the Angel of Death lost his equilibrium. The giant stumbled, his bolter shot going wide, blowing a crater into the wall. Seizing the microsecond of disorientation, Paul flowed up the side of the Space Marine like oil. He wasn't fighting a man, he was dismantling a tank. He utilized the Prana Bindu discipline to maximize his leverage, turning Draco's own immense momentum against him. As the Castellan thrashed, trying to grab the flea on his back, Paul drove his adamantine sharn into the soft, rubberized seal behind the knee joint. He didn't aim for flesh, he aimed for the motive cabling. The shard severed the primary hydraulic line and the fiber optic nerve bundle controlling the leg. Pressurized oil sprayed out in a black jet, coating Paul's face. The leg seized instantly, the heavy ceramite becoming a dead weight of half a ton. Draco roared, not in pain but in fury, as his leg buckled, forcing him to one knee. The god of war had been brought low by a man with a piece of scrap metal. The other Black Templars hesitated. Their indoctrination told them that a Castellan was invincible against anything less than a war boss or a chaos lord. To see a baseline human humiliate their leader caused a momentary lapse in their combat subroutines. Paul did not waste the moment. He landed softly in front of the kneeling giant. Draco struggled to rise, his servos whining in protest against the dead weight of his armor, his chainsword revving impotently. Paul placed a hand on the Startes' faceplate. He could have driven the shard into the eye lens, ending the life of the veteran warrior. Instead, he leaned in, his voice passing through the helmet's grill. "You fight with the strength of a dying sun," Paul whispered, his tone filled with a melancholic pity. "But you are trapped in orbit. Go back to your ships. Tell your masters that the desert has come to the stars." He pulled back, leaving a bloody handprint on the black visor. Paul retreated into the smoke before the rest of the squad could recover their wits and open fire. He moved with the chaotic rhythm of the desert walk, stepping without rhythm to confuse their targeting arrays. From the shadows of the ventilation shafts, he watched the scene unfold. The Black Templars formed a defensive ring around their crippled leader, their bolters scanning the darkness, but the confidence was gone from their posture. They dragged Draco back toward the drop pods, their retreat covering the extraction. Paul slumped against a rusted pipe, the adrenaline fading, replaced by the crushing weight of his terrible purpose. He had won the skirmish, but he had confirmed his worst fear. The Imperium was not a political entity, it was a religious machine. They would not negotiate. They would return with greater numbers, with bigger guns, with titans. The jihad was inevitable. The golden path here was not a road to peace, it was a river of blood that would drown the galaxy.
High above the tortured atmosphere of Golgotha Secundus, within the sanctum of the strike cruiser Eternal Crusader, navigator Orestes floated in a tank of amniotic fluids. He was a creature of the Navis Nobilitae, a mutant bred for a singular purpose, to gaze into the hell of the immaterium and find the road of light. Tubes of braided silver connected his elongated skull to the ship's cogitators, feeding the raw data of the warp directly into his pineal gland. Orestes opened his third eye, the warp eye, and the steel walls of the chamber dissolved. He was no longer in a ship, he was a speck of dust floating on a violent purple ocean. The warp was tumultuous today, churned by the psychic backlash of the surface war and the storm that the heretic had summoned. Orestes sought the beacon, the golden light of the Astronomicon emanating from Holy Terra, the only fixed point in a galaxy of madness. But as he scanned the currents, he found the light was dimming, not fading, but being eclipsed. A shadow fell across the Empyrean. It was not the jagged, hungry shadow of a demon, nor the vast, uncaring shadow of the tyrannid hive mind. It was a geometric construction, a perfect, sterile sphere of silence expanding rapidly from the planet below. Orestes recoiled, his psychic senses screaming as they hit a wall of absolute probability. Where the warp was chaos and emotion, this barrier was pure, cold calculation. It was the imposition of order upon chaos.
Through the roiling mists of the warp, a figure coalesced. It projected itself not as a warrior in armor, but as a towering, hooded silhouette, its eyes burning with a blue saturation that made the navigator's soul ache. The figure did not swim in the warp, it stood upon it, as if the Sea of Souls were solid ground. Orestes tried to look away, to sever the connection, but the figure's gaze pinned him like a butterfly on cork. "You navigate by looking at a distant fire," the voice of Paul Atreides echoed, not in Orestes' ears, but in the meat of his brain. "You are children playing in the surf, terrified of the deep." The navigator thrashed in his suspension tank, the amniotic fluid bubbling with his panic. He tried to summon the defensive rights of his house, the mental wards that protected him from possession, but this intruder simply dismantled them with a thought. Paul was not attacking, he was rewriting the navigational charts. "I do not need a lighthouse," Paul continued, his psychic avatar growing larger, eclipsing the distant shimmer of the Astronomicon. "I am the path. I see every grain of sand, every outcome, every wave before it breaks. Your guild is obsolete." It was a declaration of war not just on the Imperium, but on the very physics of their travel. The spacing guild of Paul's universe had surrendered to him for this very reason. He held the monopoly on movement. Paul raised a hand, and the warp around the fleet solidified. The currents stopped. The tides froze. It was a metaphysical impossibility, the chaotic energy of the immaterium arrested by the sheer force of a human will. Orestes screamed as his third eye went blind. It wasn't physical blindness, it was worse. The concept of direction had been erased from his mind. He could see the warp, but he could make no sense of it. Up was down, future was past, and the Astronomicon was gone, completely blocked by the silhouette of the mouse. Paul had severed the fleet's connection to Terra. They were becalmed in the void, trapped in a gravity well of prescience. "You cannot leave. To travel without my blessing is to be lost in the void forever. Fold your sails, navigator. The spice does not flow for you." On the bridge of the Eternal Crusader, alarms shrieked, a discordant choir of disaster. Gellerfield fluctuation, a servitor droned. Navigator signal lost. The Astronomicon is obscured. The shipmaster, Marshal Helbrecht, or his acting lieutenant, watched the hololiths in horror. The fleet was blind. They could not translate into the warp to escape, and they could not stay here without risking the wrath of the anomaly below. In his sanctum, Navigator Orestes convulsed, blood pouring from his eyes and nose, clouding the clear tank red. He clawed at the glass, gasping for air, his mind fractured by the encounter. He had looked into the abyss, and for the first time in the history of his house, the abyss had not looked back. It had simply told him he was unemployed. The fleet was stranded. They were no longer besiegers, they were prisoners. And down on the surface, the man who had stolen the stars waited for their surrender.
The air did not scream with drop pods this time. It shimmered with the chime of teleportation homers, a sound like crystal singing in a cathedral. The gloom of the hive city was instantly banished by a blinding amber incandescence. From the golden light they stepped forth, the Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000. The Emperor's own companions. They did not wear the utilitarian ceramite of the Astartes. They were clad in auramite, a rare alloy that shone with the brilliance of a captured star, impervious to all but the most cataclysmic weaponry. Shield Captain Valerian led the detachment, his guardian spear, Gnosis, humming with a disruption field that tasted of ozone and ancient duty. They moved with a silence that was terrifying for giants of their stature. There was no stomping, no revving of engines, only the fluid, liquid grace of apex predators entering a pen of sheep. The atmospheric pressure in the plaza dropped, not from physics, but from the sheer psychic weight of their presence.
They were the physical manifestation of the Emperor's wrath, and they had not come to conquer, they had come to delete. Paul Atreides watched them materialize, and for the first time since waking in this nightmare universe, his mentat projections returned a probability of survival that was absolute zero. He analyzed their physiology instantly. If the Space Marines were the Sardaukar, brutal, effective, mass-produced shock troops, then these beings were the Jannah's swordmasters raised to the power of godhood. Each one was a handcrafted work of genetic alchemy, a philosopher king created to safeguard the ultimate treasure. Paul saw the nuances in their stance. They did not stand in a shield wall. They stood as individual lions, each perfectly capable of slaughtering an army alone. They were beautiful, terrible, and utterly alien to the concept of mercy. Paul felt a pang of jealous admiration. This was the perfection he had sought for humanity, the stagnation of the golden path made flesh. They were the ultimate trap, a species evolved not to thrive, but to protect a corpse. The Fedayeen, drunk on the victory against the Black Templars and the fervor of the Lisan al-Gaib, charged. It was a tragic suicide. The Custodes did not brace, they flowed. Valerian spun his guardian spear, the blade moving so fast it became a golden disk of death. He did not hack, he danced. A single sweep decapitated 3 men, the molecular edge cauterizing the wounds before blood could spill. The Custodes fired the bolters built into their spears, single distinct shots that never missed. Heads vanished in red mists, limbs were severed with surgical precision. It was not a battle, it was housekeeping. The Custodes did not shout war cries, they did not taunt, they simply advanced, stepping over the corpses of Paul's followers without breaking stride, their plumes of red horsehair swaying gently in the wind of their own violence. The massacre was total. In 30 seconds, the plaza was silent save for the hum of power weapons. Paul stood alone amidst the ruin of his short-lived crusade. He centered his being, drawing in the prana of the air, preparing the most potent vocalization in the Bene Gesserit arsenal. He focused on Valerian, who was now 5 paces away, raising his spear for the execution. He unleashed the voice, putting every ounce of his psychic will into the command. Kneel! The air rippled with the sonic impact. Dust was kicked up from the floor. But Valerian did not kneel. The shield captain merely tilted his helm, the auramite helm absorbing the sound waves. The Custodes were not just physically superior, they were psychically proofed, their souls inscribed with the Emperor's own wards, their minds constructed to reject any command but his own. To a custodian, the voice of a foreign messiah was nothing more than the buzzing of an insect. Your witchcraft finds no purchase here, anomaly. Valerian spoke, his voice a rich baritone that sounded like tectonic plates shifting. We are the aegis, we are the wall. The guardian spear lowered, the tip hovering inches from Paul's throat. The energy field prickled his skin, smelling of ozone and ancient duty. Paul looked into the red lenses of the giant's helm and saw the end of his physical journey. He could dodge a space marine, he could not dodge this. To fight would be undignified. It would be a waste of the data he had gathered. The golden path required survival, but in this universe, survival required submission. Paul released his stance, his muscles relaxing, his hands opening to show he held no weapon. He looked up, his blue within blue eyes meeting the red gaze of the custodian. I surrender, Paul said, his voice calm, regaining its regal composure. You are the jailers of the God Emperor. Very well. Take me to your prisoner. I would speak with the man who built this golden cage. Valerian paused, the logic of the request processing in his tactical cognitators. The order was to eliminate the threat, but the sheer audacity of the heretic and the psychic resonance he still projected suggested a complexity that required the attention of the throne itself. Bind him, Valerian commanded. The 10,000 eyes shall judge this soul.
Paul did not stand physically within the Sanctum Imperialis.
To do so would be to burn instantly, his atoms scattered by the radiation of a dying star. Instead, he was bound within the psionic restraints of a sanctioned astropathic relay aboard the Black Ship, surrounded by the Silent Sisters, null maidens whose very presence made his skin crawl with the nausea of spiritual void. But his mind traveled the forbidden highways of the Empyrean. Propelled by the raw psychic amplification of the ship's choir, Paul's consciousness streaked across the galaxy, drawn moth-like to the searing beacon of Terra. He bypassed the physical defenses, the orbital plates, and the eternity gate. He entered the realm of pure thought, where the Golden Throne was not a machine of gears and pistons, but a metaphysical lighthouse standing defiant against an encroaching ocean of madness. The pressure was immense, a gravity well of suffering and willpower that threatened to crush his ego into dust. He was no longer the Duke, nor the Emperor of known space. He was a candle standing before a supernova. The transition was absolute. One moment, the cold dark of the void, the next, a blinding, searing gold that smelled of ozone and ancient blood. Paul stood upon a floor of psychic glass, beneath a sky of burning text, the billions of prayers screaming out from humanity every second. Before him sat the anathema. In the material realm, he was a rotting corpse bound to a life support system. Here, in the warp, he was a titan of light, a warrior king in Oramite armor that shone with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. His face was a shifting mask of agony and determination, eyes burning with a terrible intelligence that had witnessed the birth and death of civilizations. Paul tried to speak, to project the voice, but his words were ash in his mouth. The entity before him did not speak in words, it spoke in concepts, in avalanches of history and logic. "You are a thread that does not belong in this tapestry," the voice thundered, vibrating the very concept of Paul's existence. "You are a ghost from a naive dream." Paul summoned his dignity, the accumulated wisdom of the Bene Gesserit and the Mentat logic. He projected his own avatar, a blue-robed wanderer, the Muad'Dib, small but infinitely sharp. "I offer a path out of the stagnation," Paul thought shouted, his will clashing against the golden wall. "I preserve humanity in formaldehyde. You keep them ignorant, bound in superstition, feeding on their souls to sustain your own half-life. I offer the golden path, the scattering, the evolution, the freedom from prescience itself. Let them go. Let the species evolve beyond you." The Emperor's laughter was a tectonic shift that fractured the psychic floor. Evolve, the image shifted. Paul was forced to witness the horrors of this galaxy, the tyrannid swarms consuming galaxies, the necrons awakening to reclaim the stars, and the great enemy, chaos, waiting to pour into real space the moment the Emperor's concentration faltered. "There is no scattering here, little mouse. There is only the wall. If I fall, humanity does not evolve, it is consumed." The realization struck Paul with the force of a physical blow. He looked deeper into the golden light and saw the truth he had missed. This being was not a tyrant out of desire, he was a prisoner of necessity. The Emperor was a Kwisatz Haderach who had peered into the future and seen only one narrow, agonizing channel where humanity survived, a path that required his eternal torture. In Paul's universe, the threat was stagnation. In this universe, the threat was literal damnation. The Emperor had made the ultimate sacrifice that Paul had been too afraid to make. He had given up his humanity, his life, and his peace to become the shield. "You saw my path," Paul whispered, the realization humbling him. "You saw the timeline where I existed." "I saw infinite paths," the Emperor replied, the tone shifting from wrath to a cold, melancholic pity. "Your path leads to ruin in this reality. The warp is too hungry. Your jihad would feed the dark gods, not starve them. You are a variable I cannot tolerate." The debate was over.
It was not a meeting of equals, it was a correction of an error. The golden light began to expand, not to illuminate, but to erase. Paul felt his psychic defenses, the shields that had withstood the water of life, crumble like dry parchment. He looked at the golden figure one last time and felt a strange kinship. They were both victims of foresight, trapped by the visions they had dared to see. "Then do what you must," Paul said, closing his eyes in the Empyrean. "But know that the sleeper has awakened, even if only for a moment." The Emperor raised a sword of psychic fire. "Sleep now, Paul Atreides. Your dream is over." The blade descended, not to kill his body, but to sever the silver cord that bound his consciousness to this plane. The world dissolved into white fire, a cleansing agony that scrubbed the timeline of his interference.
The psychic thunderclap faded, leaving only the sterile hum of the black ship's life support systems. Paul Atreides slumped in the retreat chair, the blood draining from his face, leaving him pale as the moon of a dead world. The connection had been severed. The Emperor had spoken, and the weight of that communication had burned out the intricate neural pathways of the Kwisatz Haderach. He was no longer a nexus of destiny. He was merely a man, exhausted and hollowed out by a truth too vast for a single universe to contain. Shield Captain Valerian stepped forward, his movements heavy with a solemnness that transcended his conditioning. He drew his misericordia, the long Oramite dagger granted to the Custodes to deliver the Emperor's peace. There was no malice in the gesture. "You saw him," Valerian stated, not as a question, but as a verdict. Paul lifted his head, his blue within blue eyes dimming, the prescience fading into the gray fog of the present. "I saw," Paul whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I saw a man holding back the ocean with his hands. He is very lonely." Valerian nodded once, then drove the blade into Paul's heart with a surgical precision that ensured instant, painless cessation. The anomaly was neutralized. The thread was cut. Below, on the surface of Golgotha Secundus, the Imperium began its final sterilization. The miracle of the Lisan al-Gaib could not be allowed to fester. The Inquisition does not pull weeds, it burns the field. The hammer of witches maneuvered into low orbit, its bombardment bays yawning open like the mouths of deep-sea predators. Inquisitor Kalen watched from the bridge as the cyclonic torpedoes were released. They fell in a silent, graceful arc, burrowing deep into the planet's crust before detonating. The result was not an explosion, but a geological unmaking. The atmosphere ignited. Continents cracked and liquefied, the oceans boiling away into steam in a matter of seconds. The hive city with its billions of souls, miners, enforcers, and the faithful Fadakin who still chanted Paul's name, was erased. There were no survivors to tell the tale of the man who stopped the sun. There was only fire, purifying and absolute, turning the world into a barren rock of glass and ash. In the weeks that followed, the administrative machine of the Adeptus Terra began the work of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Scribes with eyes sewn shut transcribed the events into the Omega Vault, redacted with heavy lines of black ink. The official record would state that Golgotha Secundus was lost to a standard Xenos incursion, likely gene-stealer in nature. There would be no mention of the Atreides, no record of the voice, and certainly no whisper of a man who had debated the master of mankind. But the bureaucracy of the Imperium is vast, and it is leaky. On the lower levels of the black ship, a servitor hesitated for a microsecond while scrubbing the audio logs of the engagement. A fragment of data, a recording of Paul's voice commanding the Astartes, was not deleted, but archived in a forgotten cogitator. It was a ghost in the machine, a digital seed waiting for the right tech priest to find it in a millennium or two. The truth was buried,
but in the grim darkness of the far future, nothing stays dead forever. Yet, across the sector, a strange phenomenon began to root in the underhives of neighboring systems. It was not a coordinated rebellion, but a philosophical infection. Rumors traveled on the trade ships carried by void-born laborers and pilgrim ships. They spoke of a saint of the desert who had come to break the chains, not with weapons, but with the mind. Graffiti began to appear on the walls of manufactorums, a stylized silhouette of a desert mouse crying a single tear of blue blood. The ecclesiarchy cracked down with brutal efficiency, burning thousands of heretics, but the idea was harder to kill than the man. Paul Atreides had failed to conquer the Imperium, but he had achieved the scattering he had foreseen in his own timeline. His legend had fragmented, seeding the galaxy with a dangerous hope. He had become a martyr of a religion that had no name, a ghost haunting the edges of the imperial truth, whispering that the golden path might have had a fork in the road. Deep within the imperial palace on Holy Terra, the golden throne hummed with its eternal, torturous rhythm. The emperor sat immobile, a shriveled husk holding the gate against the night. The custodians of the inner sanctum noticed a subtle shift in the psychic readings, a fluctuation of 0.001% in the Astronomicon's output, a flicker that lasted for the span of a single heartbeat. To the galaxy, it was nothing. To the emperor, it was a farewell. He had destroyed the interloper, the boy who would be king, but he had also felt a moment of recognition. For a brief second in the warp, he had not been alone. He had seen another soul who understood the crushing burden of foresight, the terrible calculus of survival. The Emperor returned his focus to the great game, to the endless war against the Chaos Gods, but the memory remained, a grain of sand irritating the eye of a god. The spice was gone, but the universe felt slightly older, slightly colder, and infinitely more tragic.